Okay, we're ready to go. So I am going to initiate the live streaming service. And we're ready to rock and roll. And the trial may begin. All loss will be 2 hours and 15 minutes from now, barring any time extending technical difficulties. So that will be at 1:21.
Laura, have ballots been sent?
Did I not send you one? Look in your, did I not send you one in the chat?
Let me look.
I might not have in all of that,
I have it, Laura.
okay, in all of that confusion. Okay. All right.
All right, so let's call the case of Stevie Rogers v. Drew Mars. My name is Judge Smarta. Scoring judges, please look to the 2 buttons on the lower left of your screen. And remember to keep your audio and video off unless the bailiff tells you otherwise. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means the only people on the screen right now should be the advocates and me. Can the attorneys please make appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. Introductions from the plaintiff.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Julia Grieve, and along with my co-counsel, Mr. Alex Millard, we represent the plaintiff, Miss Stevie Rogers.
From defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Keen Nolan, along with my co-counsel, Miss Amelia Dodu.
Good morning, Your Honor.
I represent the defendant in these proceedings, Mr. Drew Mars.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning. So we will now hear opening statements from each party.
Briefly, Your Honor, we have a few pretrial matters.
Yes, go ahead.
We'd like to bring to the court's attention pretrial order number 17, where Judge Page ruled exhibits 1 through 7 have been pre-admitted and can be used at any time.
Any other pretrial matters?
Yes, Your Honor. Given the nature of this competition, we'd like to screen share documents for authentication purposes before they're entered into evidence. We just ask all documents be kept constructively outside the view of the jury until they've been admitted.
Yes, that's acceptable to the court.
And lastly, we'd just like to ask your preferences. Would you like us to ask permission to display demonstratives and exhibits, or should we go ahead and screen share?
Why don't you go ahead and screen share?
With that, the plaintiff is ready to go.
Thank you. Anything from the defense?
No, Your Honor. The defense is ready to proceed with opening statements.
All right, let's hear the opening statement from each party, beginning with the plaintiff. Everyone should make sure they are in speaker view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. And with that, plaintiff may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. The defendant, he was running out of time. It's August 14th, 2018, and a woman named Agatha Lee is preparing for bed. She finishes dinner and takes the pills that are set out for her by her caretaker, Drew Mars. But this night, August 14th, was different. You see, just 1 month earlier, Agatha Lee's only granddaughter, Stevie Rogers, had moved back home. The two hadn't seen each other for nearly 10 years, but that time, it didn't matter. Agatha spent hours with her granddaughter every day, talking, laughing, and on August 14th, she decided that she was going to change her will. She was going to leave her entire estate, nearly $20 million, to her granddaughter, Stevie Rogers. But she never got the chance to change that will. On the morning of August 15th, 2018, Agatha Lee was found dead in her home. You'll learn today that she was poisoned with chloroandramine. That's an over-the-counter drug which Ms. Lee was deathly allergic to. You'll learn that she was given that chloroandramine by the very person she trusted to take care of her, the defendant, Drew Mars. Because he was running out of time. He was running out of time because if Agatha Lee had the chance to change her will, well, it would mean taking the defendant out. That's why we've decided to sue the defendant today for the death of Agatha Lee. My name is Alex Millard, and along with my co-counsel, we represent the plaintiff in today's case. We've decided to sue today under the Slayer Statute. It's a law which states that any person who is found to have killed someone, well, they can't then inherit that person's estate. As a plaintiff today, we have to show to you that the defendant killed Agatha Lee, and that he did so knowingly or purposefully. And I want to be clear here, this isn't a murder trial. We don't have to prove that the defendant killed her beyond a reasonable doubt. We just have to show that based on the evidence, it's simply more likely true than not that the defendant killed Miss Lee. By the end of today's trial, we'll meet this burden of preponderance by the evidence by explaining to you why the defendant killed Miss Lee, how he did it, showing you what evidence he left behind. Today, we expect that you'll meet Stevie Rogers. She'll tell you about how in February of 2018, she received a letter from her grandmother where she was told that the defendant was put into her will. After receiving this letter, Ms. Rogers moved back home with her grandmother, and the two rekindled their relationship. On August 14th, she'll tell you that her grandmother told her that she would be changing her will, adding Ms. Rogers back in. You'll learn that the defendant, he overheard that conversation. He knew that he was going to be taken out of the will. He knew that he was running out of time. You'll also meet Mr. Bond today. He was a private investigator hired for this case. And he'll walk you through his investigation, explaining how on the night of August 14th, Agatha Lee was given chloroandramine. You'll read the autopsy report in today's case, which states that chloroandramine, well, it was the sole cause of Agatha Lee's death. The person that gave her that chloroandramine, well, they had planned to kill her. Mr. Bond will tell you that after learning how Agatha Lee died, well, he searched the entire Lee residence. And he found one bottle of chloroandramine pills. You'll learn that bottle of pills, the murder weapon in today's case, well, it was in the defendant's closet. The defendant knew that he was going to be taken out of Agatha Lee's will. Knew that Agatha Lee was deathly allergic to chloroandramine, and the defendant was the only person in possession of chloroandramine in the entire house. The defendant, he was running out of time. That's why at the end of today's trial, we'll ask you to find the defendant liable for the death of Agatha Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
Before we do the defense opening, Laura, can you hear me? Laura? Okay, Jade, can you see if you can make me a co-host from your role as a co-host right now?
Yeah, I might need walkthrough. I'm not
Yeah,
great
so
with
if
Zoom.
you click on participants, you should be able to select my name and then click the more button and see if when you click that button there's an option to make me a co-host. Laura? Okay. Laura?
I'm not
There-
seeing
You
it
might
as an
not see it from
option.
your end as a co-host.
Okay.
Laura, there are a couple of messages for you in the Slack. I think that they want you to switch me over to a co-host role and then to turn off your video feed once the defense opener begins his opening statement. Okay, I think we're all ready to go. Apologies for the interruption, everybody.
Opening statement from the defense, Your Honor.
Yes, please proceed.
Mr. Millard, Your Honor, members of the jury. For renowned mystery novelist Agatha Lee, August 14th of 2018 seemed like another normal day. That evening, she enjoyed dinner in her study, read a chapter of her favorite book, and before 10 p.m., she turned in for bed. She went to sleep with her longtime caretaker, Drew Mars, in the bedroom next to her, and her granddaughter, Stevie Rogers, just downstairs. August 14th seemed like another normal day. But the truth is, it was far from it. The next morning, Mr. Mars goes upstairs to wake Agatha Lee, but something's wrong. He tries and he tries to wake her up, but it was too late. Agatha Lee was already dead. That's because the day before, on August 14th, someone had gone into her pill organizer, replaced her arthritis medication with a drug called chloroandramine. Agatha Lee was deathly allergic to chloroandramine, so all it took was 2 pills to kill her in her sleep. Now, moments ago, Mr. Miller came before you and he told you the person that switched those pills was the defendant, Mr. Mars, because he was in danger of being written out of Agatha Lee's will. Now, there are actually 2 key facts that we, the defense, agree with the plaintiff on. 1, that Agatha Lee was killed for her money using chloroandramine pills, and 2, that Agatha Lee's killer is sitting with us in court right now. We just don't agree on who the killer is. Throughout trial, you're going to hear testimony that's going to tell you a different story than the one that Mr. Miller just told you. It's going to tell you a story of someone who needed to blame Mr. Mars for Agatha's death. It's going to tell you the story of someone who was out of money and out of options. It's going to tell you the true story of Agatha's real killer, the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers. Now take a step back to February of 2018, 6 months before Agatha Lee is killed. That month, the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers, is written out of Agatha Lee's will and replaced with Agatha Lee's longtime caretaker, Drew Mars. Sure enough, 5 months later, the plaintiff shows up on Miss Lee's doorstep without any money, without a job, and with an unspoken ultimatum. And Miss Lee was going to write the plaintiff back into her will, or the plaintiff was going to take the money herself. She went to Miss Lee and she begged to be put back in the will, but Agatha, she wasn't going to budge. She told the plaintiff, "I'm not going to give you a single penny, not now, not when I die." So now the plaintiff was out of money and she was out of options. She had to take action and she knew the perfect scapegoat. Now the plaintiff is accusing my client, Mr. Mars, of killing Agatha Lee and is suing him under the Slayer Statute. Now, here in Midlands, that means that anybody who causes knowingly or purposely the death of another cannot receive any part of the decedent's estate. Now, to put that simply and apply that to the circumstances of this case, if you side with the plaintiff, Agatha Lee's will be void and the money will go to the next of kin, the plaintiff herself. And if you were to side with the defense, then the will would remain in place and the money would go to Mr. Mars as Agatha Lee's will intended. Now, as the defense in today's case, we carry no burden of proof. We don't have to call a single witness, produce a single piece of evidence. The burden of proof lies solely with the plaintiff and never once shifts to the defense. Now, today they have to prove their case that Mr. Mars knowingly or purposely caused the death of Agatha Lee by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning more likely than not. That means, members of the jury, throughout this trial, you're going to have to take the evidence in favor of my client and against my client and weigh them to see which side prevails. But throughout this trial, it's going to become clear that this case is about a plaintiff who was out of money and out of options. To tell you this story, the defense is going to call the author of Agatha Lee's biography. She's going to tell you about the strong relationship between Mr. Mars and Agatha, and she's going to tell you about that conversation that you heard from the plaintiff. The conversation in which Miss Lee supposedly told the plaintiff that the plaintiff was going to get the money. Now, then you're going to hear from the defendant himself, and he's going to tell you his story. He's going to tell you about all the years that he spent with Miss Lee and about how after the will was switched, that's when the plaintiff returned. And he's going to tell you about that conversation. He's going to tell you about the conversation between Miss Lee and the plaintiff and about how Miss Lee told the plaintiff that she was never going to get back into the will. At the conclusion of this trial, my co-counsel, Ms. Dodu, is going to come here before you. She's going to review the facts and the evidence of this case with you one last time. And she's going to show you how this case is about a plaintiff who was out of money and out of options. She's going to ask that you find the defendant, Mr. Mars, not liable. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, counsel. All right, so before the plaintiff calls its first witness, I will ask everyone to switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right of your screen. This will allow you to see the attorneys and witness at the same time. So with that is, the plaintiff may call its first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Stevie Rogers. May I proceed?
You may.
Good morning, Ms. Rogers. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Of course. Hello, I'm Stephanie Rogers, but everyone calls me Stevie.
Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Well, I'm 33 years old. I'm originally from San Francisco, but I've lived all over the world at this point. I live here now in Midlands.
Are you living with family here?
No. I was living with my my grandmother, Agatha Lee, but she was killed 2 years ago.
Let's talk a little bit more about your relationship with your grandmother, Ms. Lee. Were you two close?
Growing up, Yes. We spent so much time together. I saw her every single summer in Alabama. We spent time cooking in her kitchen, playing backgammon, all sorts of games. It was always the highlight of the year.
But you said that growing up you were close. Did that relationship change?
I had thought so. I mean, after my parents died, I retreated. I didn't want to do much of anything. I didn't want to call my family, and I didn't see her very often, but I still thought we were close. You know, we had a bond, but, well, Nana, she seemed to think that we had grown apart.
What do you mean?
Back in February of 2018, she sent me this letter telling me how upset she was at me, that I retreated.
Ms. Grieve, could you pull up Exhibit 10 for us? Ms. Rogers, what do you see on your screen there?
That looks like a copy of the letter I was just talking about.
Is it a fair and accurate copy of that letter?
As I remember it, yes.
Your Honor, at this time, we move Exhibit 10 into evidence.
Any objections?
One objection, Your Honor. The plaintiff hasn't stated whether this document has been changed and altered in any way, and I just asked that he ask that question to the defendant, to the
All right.
plaintiff.
So it sounds like we have a foundation objection. Counsel, are you prepared to lay a little bit more foundation?
If the foundation is solely that authentication, I believe I did ask whether this looks the same as she remembers it, which would lay that foundation of whether or not it's been changed or altered. I know we don't have a court reporter, but I believe I asked that. If opposing counsel says that's not the case, I'm happy to ask this witness that question.
So you may have laid the foundation. So I think that the record is probably sufficient in terms of authentication to go ahead and admit the document. So with that, Exhibit 10 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Ms. Rogers, what did your grandmother say to you in this letter?
Well, she wrote that because we became family in name only, she was going to change her will. She wanted to take me out and leave everything to Drew Mars.
At the time that you received this letter, back in February of 2018, did you know who the defendant, Drew Mars, was?
No. I mean, I knew that Drew was Nana's caretaker, but I never really met Drew. No.
After receiving this letter, did you go visit your grandmother?
Yes, I did. Not immediately, but I went there on July 4th of 2018.
Why did you visit her on July 4th?
Well, the letter, you see, it brought back a lot of emotions. Made me think about where I got right and where I went wrong. And you see, this year in particular was the 10-year anniversary of my parents' death, July 4th specifically. So I don't know. Everything just crystallized, and it made me miss Nana more than I had in a long time.
How long did you stay with your grandmother, Miss Lee?
From July 4th until she passed in August.
Ms. Rogers, let's focus on what happened the day before she passed, August 14th. To your knowledge, who was at Agatha Lee's home on August 14th, 2018?
Well, the only people I saw that day are the people who lived there. That would be myself, Nana, and Drew Mars.
Okay. Well, how did August 14th begin for you?
I had breakfast with Nana in her study. She was telling me about how happy she was that I'd come back, and it really felt like old times again.
What did you two talk about specifically that morning?
Well, at one point, we talked about her will. Nana told me that she wanted to draw up a new will and leave everything to me instead.
At the time that she told you she was changing her will, did you know if anyone else would be taken out of it?
Well, yes, Drew Mars. At least that's who Nana told me she was leaving everything to before, like in the letter that we just saw.
Ms. Rogers, let's be clear about the timing of everything. Ms. Grieve, could you put up a timeline for us? Ms. Rogers, at what time did Miss Lee tell you she was changing her will?
We had that conversation at about 11:30 on the 14th.
Let the record reflect we're adding a tag to this timeline. It states at 11:30 a.m. Lee says she'll leave her entire estate to Rogers. During this conversation, when your grandmother told you she was changing her will, was anyone else in the room?
Inside the room? No. But as soon as Nana and I left the room, I saw Drew Mars just sitting right there by the door.
Did the defendant say anything to you then?
You know, at this point, I can hardly believe it, but yes, he did. He turned to me and he said, "No way."
At what time did the defendant say this to you?
At the end of that same conversation, 11:30.
Let the record reflect we're adding a tag which states that at 11:30, the defendant mouths "no way" to Ms. Rogers. After the defendant mouthed this to you, when did you next see Agatha Lee?
Sometime in the early afternoon. She had a lunch meeting and came back. Then we watched a movie, had an early dinner, and said goodnight to each other at around 9:30.
Did you see the defendant at any time after 9:30?
Yes, maybe even 5 minutes after I said goodnight to Nana, I saw Drew Mars walking toward Nana's room.
Let the record reflect we're adding a tag which states around 9:35 p.m. the defendant was seen walking toward Agatha Lee's room. And we can take that down now, Ms. Grieve. Thank you. Do you know what the defendant was doing when you saw him around 9:35 that night?
No, I mean, I have my ideas, but I don't know for sure. All I saw was Drew walking towards Nana's room with their hand like this. I don't know, maybe like he was holding something.
And let the record reflect that the witness has held up her hand, a palm up with her fingers curled. Did you see your grandmother again after you saw the defendant walking towards her room?
No, I never saw her alive again.
Ms. Rogers, I want to talk now about your grandmother's passing. When did you learn that she had died?
The next morning, on August 15th.
When did you wake up on the 15th?
I don't know, 8:30, 8:35. I didn't wake up. Drew woke me up. He was banging on the door. It scared me. I shot up. I ran to go open it.
Did the defendant say anything to you then?
Yes, he said that Nana wasn't waking up. You know, I didn't really know what he meant. It felt like time had stopped. All I remember is running past Drew and going to Nana's room. She didn't have a pulse.
What did you do then?
I called the police. I didn't understand why Drew hadn't. Nana she looked lifeless.
Do you know how your grandmother died?
I do now.
Objection.
Read the
Your Honor.
autopsy.
This
We have an
question is,
objection.
this
Go
question
ahead.
goes into lack of personal knowledge and speculation. This question is asking the plaintiff to speculate how her grandmother died.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. I had asked her whether she knew this. The witness said yes, and then I believe was beginning to explain how. If not, I was going to ask her how she knew that, and if I may proffer.
You may.
The witness, Ms. Rogers, has read the autopsy in today's case, which states the cause of death.
Any response to that, counsel?
No response, Your Honor.
All right. Well, it sounds like the witness is going to state her understanding of how she came by this information. If there are no objections to that, then objection overruled.
Ms. Rogers, could you tell us how you found out how your grandmother died?
I read the autopsy report and the toxicology screening. I know that it's from chlorandramine.
Ms. Grieve, could we display that timeline again? Thank you. Ms. Rogers, according to the autopsy report, at what time did your grandmother die?
Sometime between 9 p.m. on the 14th and 3 a.m. on the 15th.
Let the record reflect we're adding a tag which states the time of death was between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. Thank you, Ms. Grieve. We can take that down. You mentioned that your grandmother had died from chlorandramine. Did you know that your grandmother had an allergy to this drug?
You know, I didn't know for like 30 years, basically my entire life. But I did find out she had that allergy 2 weeks before she died.
How did you learn about this allergy?
Drew Mars told me about it. One day we were just sitting in the living room and Drew told me, Agatha has a fatal allergy to chlorandramine. Did you know? What? I didn't. Drew said if she took one pill of chlorandramine, she'd be dead.
Ms. Rogers, let's shift gears a bit here and talk about the reading of your grandmother's will. What day was that?
August 20th.
Ms. Grieve, could you share a copy of Exhibit 9 for us? Ms. Rogers, what's that on your screen right now?
This looks like the will that was read on the 20th, what I remember hearing.
And is this a fair and accurate copy of this will?
As I remember it, yes, it hasn't been changed.
Your Honor, at this time, we move to enter Exhibit 9 into evidence.
Any objection?
Sorry, Your Honor, my microphone. No objection, Your Honor.
Okay, without objection, Exhibit 9 is admitted.
Ms. Rogers, what were the terms of Agatha Lee's will according to this document?
Drew Mars inherited the entire estate. I guess Nana left everything the way she said she would in that letter to me back in February.
After this will reading, you sued the defendant, Drew Mars. Why?
Drew is the one who told me about my grandmother's allergy to chlorandramine. He was in charge of her medications. Nana told me that she was leaving everything to Drew before, but then the day after she and I talk about her will, she dies? I don't believe it's a coincidence.
Thank you. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Cross-examination, Your Honor.
Yes, please.
Good morning, Ms. Rogers. I'd like to
Good
talk
morning.
first. Good morning. I'd like to talk first about your financial situation. So you received an inheritance from your parents by the age of 21, is that correct?
That's right. After they passed away, they wanted me to be taken care of. And they left me a trust fund.
And this trust fund consisted of about $2 million. Does that sound accurate?
That's right. It began with $2 million. That's true.
And you lived off of this money.
I did. I never really had a real job. I spent a lot of time traveling and living in other places. So that's what got me by.
That's right. You never had a job and you spent a lot of your time traveling.
Yes, I did. I took advantage of being young and having resources. Wish I'd learned earlier on that wasn't the way to go.
So a pretty lavish lifestyle, you would say.
More or less. I did do some. I wanted to be a writer like my nana, so I took some classes and wanted to publish a novel, but I mostly did have fun.
And going back to my questions, as all things do, the money in your bank account started to run out. Is that right?
Oh, yes, of course. Like we just said, I was using it for pretty much everything. By June of 2018, I only had about a few $1,000s in my trust fund left.
$2,000? This was after you had hired a private investigator to find Agatha Lee.
I'm sorry. What do you mean?
At what point in time did you attempt to find your grandmother?
Oh, right after I got that letter, the one where she told me that, we'd become family in name only. I wanted to find her, but I couldn't. So that's when I hired a private investigator.
And how much did this private investigator cost you?
$10,000.
And before the private investigator, you had about $12,000 in your bank account. Is that right?
That sounds right. Yes, I knew that hiring that private investigator was going to be a good chunk, but I wasn't too worried. If I needed cash, I could sell a lot of items that I had.
So just to clarify, by way of simple math, you had about $2,000 left in your bank account after hiring the private investigator.
Right.
Thank you. I'd like to move my focus into your arrival at Lee Manor. You had not seen your grandmother for almost 7 years. Is that correct?
It's true. It goes by so fast, but yeah, I hadn't really spent time with her properly since my parents passed away.
So from 2011 to 2018, you hadn't seen her or been in contact with her besides her letters to you.
Right. We called a couple of times, but I hadn't seen her. That's true.
Well, to correct you, you called her once.
I remember calling her once, but that's all I remember. Yeah.
So that's a yes.
Yes.
And after reading this letter that you received from your grandmother, you realized that you were being disinherited.
Right. She told me she was taking me out of the will and she had her mind made up.
And she was switching the sole beneficiary from you to Drew Mars.
Right. That's what she wrote in the letter.
Now I'd like to move on to August 14th. On this day, you were having breakfast with your nana, and eventually Agatha Lee left with Drew Mars.
Right. She had a lunch meeting and Drew drove Nana everywhere, basically. So they left at some point, yes.
And once they left at 11:30, you remained in Lee Manor by yourself. Is that correct?
That's right. Whenever they stepped out, I was the only person in there.
And they had left you alone for a couple of hours, you would say?
That sounds right. I think they got back 2 hours later after lunch.
And there were no cameras in the house, is that correct?
No, I mean, Nana's not that high tech. I don't believe there are.
So they left you in Lee Manor by yourself for a few hours.
They didn't leave me there. They had gone to lunch and I had stayed home.
Okay. I'd also like to move on to the evening of August 14th, after Nana had come back and you'd spent some time with her. What did you do after she went to bed?
We said goodnight to each other and I had a tough time falling asleep. I remember having a few drinks, trying to, relax and fall asleep.
A few alcoholic drinks?
Sorry, yeah, I haven't said a few drinks and not meant that for a while now.
And do you recall how many drinks you had that night?
Objection.
Not really.
At this point to relevance, may I explain?
You may.
The amount of drinks at which Miss Rogers had on the night of the 14th after her grandmother had already gone to bed doesn't make any fact in this case more or less likely, and thus is not relevant.
Response,
Your Honor. This, Stevie Rogers had approximately 3 drinks of an alcoholic drink that night. As stated in their direct, she then witnessed Drew Mars walking with something in her palm. I'm afraid this attacks the credibility of the witness because having alcoholic drinks and then trying to testify about what they saw is quite impaired in this opinion.
May I respond on those grounds?
yes, but first, can you, is it correct? And because I just, I can't remember precisely, but did the witness testify about the conduct of Mr. Mars the day after the decedent's death?
No, Your Honor. The only testimony about Mr. Mars, the defendant, was that she had seen the defendant walking toward Agatha Lee's room 5 minutes after she said goodnight to her. This would be before any of these drinks. So if opposing counsel is trying to use this line of questioning to show that her judgment may have been impaired on the night of the 14th, well, it doesn't go to any of the facts that we've already discussed and is thus still not relevant.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
The plaintiff did testify about Mars the next day as well, and I'm afraid this is extremely relevant in today's case.
Well, I think I understand the argument that to attack the credibility of the witness about alcohol consumption would require some of her observations to potentially be diminished. I'm not entirely sure if sequentially any of her observations that she testified to earlier occurred after she consumed the beverages, but I'm going to go ahead and allow the testimony. It's sort of a close call just because the timeline isn't very clear, but I think it is important to the extent that the witness's observations were diminished anyway for, that to come onto the record.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to get one last thing clear. Stevie Rogers, you knew what chlorandramine was, is that correct?
Yes. I mean, I knew it's a medication you could buy over the counter.
Exactly. It's something you can purchase easily because it has no restriction on the buyer.
Right. I actually hadn't heard about chlorandramine until Drew Mars told me about it 2 weeks before my Nana passed away.
But you did know.
Right. Yes. It's a medication like aspirin.
And at that same time, you also knew that this drug could be extremely dangerous to your grandmother.
Yes, I knew she had a deathly allergy to it.
Thank you. No further questions.
Any redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor. Ms. Rogers, I just want to clear up the timing of a couple of things here for us. When did you say goodnight to your grandmother on August 14th, 2018?
Around 9:30 p.m.
And when did you see the defendant walking toward her room that night?
9:35, 9:40 at the latest. It was, I want to say 5 minutes after I said goodnight to Nana. I was just going downstairs to get a drink. I hadn't even made it down there before I saw Drew walking.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor. And barring any recross examination, may this witness step down.
Counsel, do we have any recross?
No recross, Your Honor.
Okay, so yes, the witness is excused. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, the plaintiff may call its second witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Mike Bond. Permission to proceed?
Granted.
Would you please introduce yourself to the court?
Of course. The name's Bond, Mike Bond.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Bond?
I'm a private investigator, renowned consultant detective, but I won't recite my resume to you. As my grandmother used to say, when your work speaks for itself, don't interrupt.
Well, how'd you get involved in this case?
Well, actually, I was hired by Miss Rogers to first find her grandmother, Miss Agatha Lee. But on August 15th, I was hired to investigate Miss Lee's death.
Let's talk about your methods as a private investigator. What's your strategy for an investigation?
Well, I act solely as an observer of truth. I look at all my cases like a donut. You see, just a big old hole in the middle, and I gotta find the donut's hole to that donut hole. I observe the facts without biases of head or heart. I follow their path to its terminus, and the truth falls at my feet.
Mr. Bond, do you take any concrete steps for your investigation?
Sure, ma'am. The first steps of an investigation are no secret. You obviously want to talk to any potential witnesses, investigate the potential scene of the crime, and of course, gather forensic evidence.
Well, let's walk through those steps. Who did you speak to for your investigation?
Well, I interviewed Miss Rogers, of course, when I was hired, but I also spoke with Mr. Drew Mars, Miss Agatha Lee's caretaker.
Let's talk about that conversation you had with Mr. Mars. What did you learn from that?
Well, I asked Mr. Mars about the state of Miss Lee's health in the days leading up to her death. Mr. Mars said Miss Lee took some medications for arthritis and back spasms. That's also when Mr. Mars revealed to me that Miss Lee had a terrible and potentially fatal allergy.
And what was that allergy for?
Chlorandramine.
Did you ever learn what chlorandramine looked like?
Of course, ma'am. As any self-respecting private investigator would, I did some research, and I discovered that chlorandramine is an over-the-counter heartburn medication that's identical to Miss Lee's arthritis medication. Small purple pills, no taste or smell.
Did you ever learn who would typically provide Miss Lee with her medications?
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Mars told me himself that as her caretaker, it was his responsibility.
Let's move on. After that conversation with Mr. Mars, did you ever see the defendant again?
Yes, ma'am. It was about a week later. I was present for the reading of the will. Miss Lee's attorney, Kirby Doolittle, did the reading.
And who else was present for that reading?
A few people, the attorney, obviously, a detective, Miss Rogers, Mr. Mars, and a biographer.
And what happened during that reading of the will?
Well, it was revealed that the entire estate of Miss Lee had been left to Mr. Mars.
How did Mr. Mars appear to react to this news?
Well, you know, ma'am, he kept saying, I can't believe it, I had no idea. But I'd already discovered by that point that that was a lie.
Objection to lack of foundation as to that being a lie.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. My very next question is going to bring up an email that Detective Bond found inside the defendant's computer, which we're going to admit, and he's going to explain exactly how he came to that conclusion.
Response, Your
to
Honor.
that? Yes, please.
Your Honor, if this witness is going to claim that the defendant was lying, I'd ask that they first lay the foundation before the detective gets into the fact that Mr. Mars was lying, in fact.
Response, Your Honor.
Yes, please.
We're fine with laying that foundation and then asking Mr. Bond about the defendant's lie.
All right. So the witness's testimony that a lie had occurred is stricken pending further foundation. So the objection is sustained.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Bond, did you ever investigate the defendant's room?
Yes, ma'am, I did. I looked also at the defendant's laptop. That's when I found an email regarding the will.
Mr. Miller, could you put Exhibit 13 on the screen? Mr. Bond, does this appear to be that email you found on the defendant's computer?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Does it appear to be a fair and accurate picture of that email?
Yes, ma'am, that's the picture I took.
Plaintiff offers Exhibit 13.
Without objection, Your Honor.
Exhibit 13 is admitted.
Mr. Bond, what does this email say?
Well, you can see right there on the first line, it says, Agatha just told me she changed her will to leave everything to me.
And what's the date on that email?
February 1st, 2018. Now, you see, that's a good 6 months before that will was read in August. And that's also when the defendant claimed they had no idea that the will was left to them. They lied.
Objection to speculation, Your Honor. May I be heard?
You may.
Now, it's one thing for this witness to say that the statements on August 21st, when the will was read, are inconsistent with statements before that the defendant had made. For this witness to go in and say that it was a lie, that has a deceitful connotation. It makes it seem as if this witness, as Mr. Mars, was being deceitful and purposely deceptive. That would be speculation and delving into the mindset of Mr. Mars. It would be perfectly acceptable for this witness to say that it was inconsistent with prior statements, but he'd have to delve into the mindset to know exactly why he wasn't saying the same statements. Therefore, it's speculation.
Response. Yes, Your Honor. This is prima facie a lie. Evidentiary matters are by a preponderance standard. Hearing the defendant say he had no idea about that will, and then reading an email showing the exact opposite, gives Mr. Bond enough information, more likely than not, that the defendant told a lie.
Last word.
Yes, Your Honor. As I said before, to say that this is a lie that has a deceitful connotation, this witness could easily just say that it was inconsistent with prior statements, but to say that it was a lie and that it was done in a deceitful manner to trick somebody, that goes just beyond what the face value of those statements are and delves into the mindset of Mr. Mars.
Let me ask a question that I should have asked earlier. And this is, normally I would have probably figured it out sooner, but is this a bench trial or a jury trial?
This is a jury trial, Your Honor.
Correct, Your Honor.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Yes,
Your Honor. Motion to strike.
Granted.
Mr. Bond, was the content of this email inconsistent with what the defendant said during that reading of the will?
Yes, ma'am, it was inconsistent.
Let's move on to the next part of your investigation. You mentioned looking for forensic evidence. Did you ever find any?
Yes, ma'am, we did.
And what was that?
Well, first were the reports of Miss Lee herself, specifically an autopsy and then a talk screen.
Mr. Millard, could you put Exhibit 2 on the screen? This has been pre-admitted. Mr. Bond, what does this autopsy show?
Well, ma'am, it says that chloroangemine was found in Miss Lee's system.
In
And
accordance to this autopsy, what was the cause of death?
The sole and conclusive cause of death, as you can see there, is a fatal allergic reaction to 2 chloroangemine pills.
Mr. Bond, did you ever see any medication found inside Lee Manor?
Yes, ma'am.
And what was that?
Well, you see, on August 21st, I was present for a search of Lee Manor, and we found a black bag and a bottle of pills inside that bag.
Mr. Millard, could you show us Exhibits 14, 15, and 17? Mr. Bond, do these appear to be pictures of the images you were just describing, that black bag, a bottle of pills?
Yes, ma'am. You see on the left there, that's the bag I was talking about. The picture in the middle is the bottle of pills found inside that bag. And the picture on the right is Drew Mars' closet, where we found that bag with the pill bottle inside.
And do these appear to be fair and accurate pictures of what you saw inside Lee Manor?
Yes, ma'am.
Plaintiff offers Exhibits 14, 15, and 17.
No objections, Your Honor.
All right, 14, 15, and 17 are admitted.
Mr. Bond, let's start with that black bag. Can you tell us where it was found?
Sure. It was found in Drew Mars' closet. It was right under that blanket and that gray sweater thing hanging there in the closet.
Now, you also discussed that bottle of pills. Did you ever find out what that medication was?
Yes, ma'am. As I said earlier, we ran a talk screen, and the result of that toxicology screen was that those pills were conclusively chloroangemine.
Do you know if any forensic testing was done on that black bag?
Yes, ma'am, there was.
And what were the results of that test?
A partial fingerprint was found on that bag. It came back as a match to Mr. Drew Mars.
Mr. Bond, let's look at your investigation as a whole. Mr. Millard, if you could pull up our chart. Considering your entire investigation, did you find evidence the defendant had access to Miss Lee's medications?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Did you find evidence that the defendant had knowledge of Miss Lee's allergy?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
And lastly, did you find evidence of the defendant's fingerprints inside Lee Manor?
Yes, ma'am, we did.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. No further questions at this time.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Good morning, Mr. Bond.
I'm sorry.
Good morning, Mr. Bond.
Oh, good morning, Mr. Nolan. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, sir?
I'm good. Thank you for asking.
I gotta say, my family's a big fan of your detective work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I don't like to brag too much, but thank you.
Now, my daughter, in fact, is a big fan of your accent. Is that Alabama?
Oh, sir, no, sir. No. It's Georgia.
The relevance, well, I appreciate hearing more about Mr. Bond. It's not relevant to these proceedings, the source of his accent.
I can move on, Your Honor.
All right. Objection sustained.
Okay, Mr. Bond, I'd like to start by talking about the first time you ever met with the plaintiff. Now, the first time you met the plaintiff, that was in June of 2018.
Yes, sir, down in Monroeville, Alabama.
And the plaintiff, she was asking you if you'd help find her grandmother, Agatha Lee.
Yes, sir.
Now, she paid you $10,000 to find her grandmother.
That's correct.
And so you found her in June of 2018 and you gave that information to the plaintiff.
Yes.
And then you didn't hear from the plaintiff for 2 months after that until August.
Yes, sir.
She called you the morning of August 15th and told you that her grandmother had been murdered.
That's correct.
So 2 months after you told the plaintiff the location of her grandmother, Agatha Lee had been murdered.
Yes.
So then you went straight to Lee Manor and you arrived there early in the morning around 9:30?
Yes, sir.
And now, to be clear, a while after you arrived, there was a detective from the Midlands Police that showed up.
Right, Detective Kahn.
Right, and Detective Kahn led an investigation as well, and you worked together?
Yes.
So you're completely familiar with any of the steps that Detective Kahn took throughout her investigation?
Yes, the ones in the report and the ones I witnessed, yes.
Now, sir, as soon as Detective Kahn arrived, that's when the plaintiff said Agatha had been murdered.
Yes.
So right away, the plaintiff, she was pushing a narrative.
Well, I don't know what exactly she was pushing, sir. I just know what she said.
Well, let's talk about what exactly the plaintiff did throughout the investigation. I'm now going to put a graph on the screen, a table. Are you able to see that, Mr. Bond?
Yes.
Now, as you said, the first person to suggest murder in this case, that was the plaintiff.
Correct, yes.
It wasn't you and it wasn't Detective Kahn?
That's right.
All right, then after that, Detective Kahn arrived and she went into Agatha's bedroom.
Yes.
And in there, she started taking some pictures.
Right.
And she took a picture of Agatha's pill organizer.
Yes.
And now the person that suggested that she take that very specific picture of the pill organizer, that was the plaintiff, correct?
Yes, if I remember correctly, yes.
Okay, and then after that, Detective Kahn started doing initial interviews with Mr. Mars and with the plaintiff.
Yes.
And during those interviews, the plaintiff told Detective Kahn that Agatha shouldn't be cremated because that might destroy evidence.
Yes.
It wasn't you and it wasn't Detective Kahn who suggested that that could destroy evidence.
Right.
And then after that, the plaintiff then said that they wanted Miss Lee to get an autopsy.
Yes, it was in a conversation, I believe, in a study.
She was the first one to suggest that.
Yes.
And then she got even more specific than that, correct?
What do you mean, Mr. Nolan?
Well, she wanted there to be a toxicology screening.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
This was in the morning, a couple hours after Miss Lee's body had been found.
Right, that was during our conversation around 10 o'clock that morning.
Okay, well, I'd like to then move and talk about when you searched through Lee Manor, okay?
Yes, sir.
And now that was several days later, 6 days later.
Yes.
Now, during those 6 days, the plaintiff and the defendant, Mr. Mars, were allowed to stay at the house.
To the best of my knowledge, yes, sir.
Now, during that time, you'd agree that would be ample time for the killer to dispose of evidence.
Objection, Your Honor, to speculation. At this point, we're asking Mr. Bond to take a guess as to what the killer may or may not have been able to do.
If I may, Your Honor.
Yes.
I'm asking this witness as a detective. He stated on direct examination there was foundation laid that he's a private investigator. He's been doing this for years. He investigates cases. I'm asking that as an investigator, if he thought that 6 days would be enough for somebody to dispose of evidence. I'm not asking if he knew the killer disposed of evidence or if the killer planned to dispose of evidence. I'm asking under his own expertise.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
Mr. Bond is not a detective. We did not offer him as an expert in police investigation. He's a private investigator and he's not qualified to make determinations to that nature. Asking as to what is possible for a murderer to have done, it goes beyond an improper opinion and into speculation as to what that specific person could have done in that period of time.
Last word, Mr. Nolan.
If I may, Your Honor, detective, investigator, this witness spent the entire direct examination being asked about his investigative steps. I'm asking about his investigative steps here. If he believes it's possible that during a 6-day time frame, somebody could have moved evidence. It's a very vague question. I'm not going directly into whether he knew anybody did anything, just if that was a possibility.
I'm gonna overrule the objection. I think that regardless of whether or what subject matter the witness was qualified as an expert, I don't think it requires any expertise. I think that it is general enough in nature that we're not asking about who or how, but just, you know, essentially a lay opinion on whether there was sufficient time. So I'm going to overrule the objection. If, you know, there are more specific questions, then we can revisit. But at this point, I'm going to overrule.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Bond, there were 6 days there where the killer could have been able to move evidence.
I suppose. I'm not entirely sure, but yes.
Well, they could have been able to get rid of any evidence.
I suppose.
It's possible that the killer could have moved evidence from one room to another.
I suppose.
It's possible that the killer could have moved a bottle of chlorandramine pills into another room.
I mean, I guess, yes.
Okay, Mr. Bond, well, one last thing. Now, as you stated, Agatha Lee passed away from chlorandramine pills.
Yes, that was a medical examiner's determination.
And now it's your understanding that chlorandramine, that's an over-the-counter drug.
That's correct, yes.
And that means that anybody could go and get it at a pharmacy.
Right.
You don't need a prescription.
Correct.
You don't need to be a doctor.
Right.
You don't even need to be a caretaker.
That's correct.
Anybody could walk into a pharmacy and buy chlorandramine pills.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. I have nothing further. And Your Honor, permission to preserve the demonstrative used during cross-examination for any appeals?
Any objection to that, counsel?
No objection.
All right. Yes, granted. As to preservation of the demonstrative, and Ms. Grieve, is there any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor.
Proceed.
Mr. Bond, you were asked a lot about what the plaintiff wanted to be done with Miss Lee after she was found dead. Did the defendant tell you anything about what should be done with Miss Lee's body?
Well, Mr. Mars kept saying that Agatha wanted to be cremated, that they should just basically go right to a funeral.
Nothing further.
Any recross?
Based on those questions, no recross, Your Honor.
All right. Well, the witness may step down. Thank you. Plaintiff, any further witnesses from the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor, we rest our case.
All right, so we will now take a 5-minute break. Judges, please remember that this video is being publicly broadcast via YouTube live stream. See you all again shortly. By my clock, we should get back at around 12:18 Eastern time.
May we proceed, Your Honor?
Before we get started, let's just make sure all of our judges are in the room. Judges, if you would please turn on your cameras for just one moment. Okay, I've got Matthew, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think that that's all of us. I believe that we're ready to proceed.
All right. Do we have all counsel and witnesses ready as well?
Plaintiff is ready to proceed, Your Honor.
The
Defense?
defense as well.
All right. So defense, please call your first witness.
At this point in time, the defense calls Ms. Ryan Cabera. Hi, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Ryan Cabera.
And what do you do for a living, Ms. Cabera?
I'm a nonfiction writer here in Midlands.
And why did you choose to become an author?
Well, I had actually kind of started once I started my family. My husband, Stephen, and I have 3 young boys, and I was a stay-at-home mom for a good couple of years. Now, with 3 boys, my hands were kept pretty busy, but when I did have a little free time, I started writing short stories, really developed a love for it, and once they all got into junior high, I became an author full-time.
And how do you know Miss Agatha Lee?
Well, Agatha was actually the topic of my most latest work. I was writing a biography about her for a good couple of years back in 2018.
And what made you interested in writing her biography?
Well, Agatha Lee is kind of a legend. She wrote this really popular mystery book back in the 80s. And after she wrote this best-selling novel, she just kind of disappeared. She never published anything else. And while everyone knew about her book, no one really knew that much about her. I kind of wanted to dig in and uncover that mystery a little bit too.
Did you ever reach out to Agatha Lee and ask to write her biography?
Yeah, of course. Back in 2015, I sent a letter to her asking if she'd give me the honor of telling me her story. I didn't hear back for a while, but in 2018, at the start of the year, she told me that if I followed her terms and conditions, she'd, agree to sit down and talk with me and let me write her book.
And once she invited you to her manor, how did you interact with her?
Well, most of the times we would just kind of have conversations. I would come in with a couple interview questions for the day, and we would just kind of go from there. We'd meet up either at her house or at restaurants, and we would just spend hours talking about her books, her life, her inspirations, a little bit of anything and everything.
While you spent some time at the manor, was anyone else living there with Agatha Lee?
Yeah. When I first went to her house in February, she was living with her caretaker and her nurse, Drew Mars.
And did you ever interact with Drew Mars?
Yeah, I did. Every time I went over to Agatha's house, he was always there. I spent a good 2 to 3 days a week over there for about 6 months. So I got to know Drew somewhat well.
And did you ever personally see Mr. Mars and Miss Lee interacting?
Oh yeah, all the time.
And what did you notice about their relationship?
Honestly, they were really cute. Drew was always doting on Agatha. He would show up like every hour or so with a fresh cup of tea for her or bring her more cream for her coffee. The 2 of them seemed really close. They both spoke really positively and highly about each other. They seemed like they got along really well.
Now, Ms. Cabera, did you ever spend time alone with Miss Lee?
Yeah, of course. When we would talk about some of the more personal aspects of her life, we would typically meet in private for those.
And did she tell you anything about her relationship with Mr. Mars?
Yeah, she did. She actually talked about Drew a lot. She would say how, she thought of him almost like he was her grandson, that they were really close. She really considered him to be family.
I would like to move on to August 14th.
Sure.
What were you doing that day?
On the 14th, I actually had a meeting scheduled with Agatha. We met at this steak restaurant about 15 minutes away from her house.
And how did Miss Lee Seymour appear to you when you met?
She was a little off that day. I mean, Agatha was a really strong and inspiring woman. She was always really chatty, really eager to tell you what was going on and ask about your life as well. But that day she was really downcast, really quiet, didn't really seem interested in our conversations.
And what did you guys talk about?
We actually talked about something that she hadn't really brought up before. She started telling me a bit about her granddaughter, Stevie. She had moved back into the house at the start of July, and she was just kind of telling me about their relationship a little bit.
And did any parts of this conversation stand out to you?
Yeah. At one point, kind of out of the blue, she just told me that she hoped that Stevie would forgive her and that she was really afraid that she had made the wrong decision.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
This is an exception to hearsay pursuant to Rule 8033, the then existing mental, emotional, or physical condition. The lines, "I hope she will forgive me," speaks into the emotional state, while the lines, "I'm afraid I made the wrong decision," speaks into the fear.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. We believe that these statements are in reference to that conversation that happened earlier in the afternoon, hours before. We haven't heard any foundation that would link this emotional state being a current existing one, rather than describing how she felt before. Without that foundation showing that she's stating how she feels in this moment, as opposed to how she felt hours earlier, 8033 does not apply.
Pursuant to that response, I would then like to shift my response to using the exception to hearsay with 804. 804, give me 1 second, Your Honor. 804A4.
And can you give me the language of 804A4?
Yes, Your Honor. If we can turn to the Midlands Rules of Evidence, 804A4 speaks about the exclusion, the permission to use the statements of a declarant who is unable to make it to court today due to their death.
May I respond on this? Yes, Your Honor. Pursuant to 804, a witness being unavailable is not sufficient enough to allow out-of-court statements to be admissible. They must then meet 804 Section B, the exceptions. Without stating one of those sections, 804 does not apply.
This is
Go ahead.
Final response, Your Honor. This rule means that if someone is unavailable because of the actions of the other party, which the defense is saying Miss Lee is unavailable due to being murdered, this statement can pass as an exception to hearsay, which made Agatha Lee unavailable.
And remind me, has the defense made a affirmatively stated its belief that the opposing party, being plaintiff, is the one who caused Ms. Lee's death?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Do you agree that that is the subject the subject of this trial?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Any response before I rule, counsel, for plaintiff?
No response, Your Honor. All argument has already been stated.
All right. So my interpretation of 804, when a witness is unavailable, due to the opposing party's conduct, essentially. I don't think that's been established. Obviously, that's the subject of this trial. I think if that had been established in a previous proceeding, then 804 might be triggered. But at this point, I don't think that we can, allow the or admit the testimony under Rule 804. So I'm going to sustain the objection to hearsay.
Motion to strike the statements from Agatha Lee.
Granted.
Thank you, Your Honor. And after this conversation, did you ever make plans with Miss Lee again?
I tried to. While we were at lunch, I asked if we could meet later in the week, but later that night, Agatha passed away. So that was the last time that I ever saw her.
Thank you, Ms. Cabera. No more questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Ms. Cabrera. My name's Alex Millard, and I'm going to be asking you a couple of questions on behalf of the plaintiff, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Good morning, sir.
Now, you just told us you were Agatha Lee's biographer, right?
Yep, that's correct.
You spent a lot of time with her.
Yeah, I worked with Agatha for about 6 months before she passed.
I want to focus in on one conversation in specific in May of 2018. You remember Drew Mars, the defendant, coming into the room in May of 2018 while you were with Agatha Lee?
Yeah, I mean, that happened a couple of times, but
Sure, but there's one instance in specific where the defendant, he came in carrying a pill and a glass of water.
oh, yeah, I remember that. He brought her some of like her arthritis medication, I think.
Well, he didn't actually get the chance to tell you what that medication was, did he?
No, he started to explain what the pill was, and Agatha just stopped him and took the medication.
Right, Agatha told him, you can skip the recitation. You know, I'll take whatever you hand me, right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
I want to talk a little bit more about what you learned about Agatha Lee.
Sure.
And I do believe she's one of the best writers in American history.
Oh, I mean, definitely. She is probably one of the first great American mystery novelists.
Right? And she managed to get that title after writing only one book, right?
That's correct. Death in a Bottle was an instant bestseller and really put her name out on the map.
Yeah, and you'd agree with me, it's a bit odd that a writer that good didn't write any other books.
Oh, definitely. You know, we were all waiting for a sequel and it just never came.
Back in August, Ms. Lee, she told you she actually had written other books, didn't she?
That's correct. Yep. When we were at lunch that day, she told me that she had a whole bunch of other works, but just never decided to publish them.
And as far as you know, you're the first and only person to know that she had written other books, right?
I guess so. I'd never talked about it with anyone else, so I'm not sure who else knows.
Now, when she told you she had written other books, she also told you she'd held on to all of those manuscripts, right?
Yeah, she still had the works that she had written, sure.
And you know that those works, well, they were all kept in her study.
Yeah, that's what she said.
Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about why you're here in today's case. The defendant, Drew Mars, he called you asking you to testify, right?
Yeah, Drew asked if I would just tell you guys what I knew.
And of course, you agreed to testify today.
Clearly.
And after you agreed to testify, the defendant asked if you wanted anything of Agatha Lee's.
Yeah, he did.
And you told him you wanted the books in her study.
I sure did.
And to be clear, you really wanted those unpublished books from Agatha Lee, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, like we said, she was an amazing author. I wanted to see what else she had created.
Right. You wanted those books, yes?
Yeah.
Now, after agreeing to test, or after asking whether or not you could have those books, the defendant, he said, well, at the end of this trial, if I'm still in possession of Agatha Lee's estate, they're all yours, right?
Yeah, he said if he had the books, he'd let me take them.
And he told you after this trial ended if he was still in control of the estate, right?
I mean, I don't really get how, all the legal stuff works, but I guess that's the case.
Sure, but I'm just asking what he told you. And so yes, he told you if he's still in control of the estate after this trial.
Yeah, he said if he had the books, he'd let me take them.
And now you're here testifying on behalf of that defendant.
I suppose.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Brief redirect, Your Honor.
Proceed.
Now, Ms. Cabera, I'd just like to ask one more question.
Sure.
Are you here testifying in court today because you know you'll receive these books?
No, I just am here to tell you guys what I knew about Agatha, and that's about it.
Thank you, Ms. Cabera. No more questions, Your Honor.
Any recross?
No recross examination.
All right, the witness may step down. Thank you. All right, the defense may call its next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Drew Mars. May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Good morning. Please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
Hi, I'm Drew Mars.
Mr. Mars, I want to talk about your relationship with Agatha Lee. When did you first meet her?
That was back when I was a junior in college. I saw an ad in the newspaper for a local caretaker position, and when I applied for the job, I found out it was for the famous novelist Agatha Lee. I got the job.
Were you working for her full time?
Not at first. I was just hired on as a part-time employee, but after Agatha suffered a heart attack the first year after I started working, she required 24/7 monitoring. So she brought me on full time and I moved into her house.
And where were you living during that time?
I was living in Lee Manor, the estate that she had in one of the guest rooms upstairs.
As a full-time caretaker, what were your duties?
I was just there to monitor her health condition, make sure she was doing as well as she could. So I keep track of her heart rate, that type of thing. And I would also do anything to help lighten the load around the house. You know, if she needed something cooked, I'd do it. If she needed to be driven somewhere, I'd help her out.
And how were you compensated for your work?
She did everything for me. She gave me a place to stay, free for rent, gave me food to eat. She paid me a nice salary. She gave me a raise at the end of the year without me asking her. She did everything.
How would you describe your relationship with Agatha Lee?
She was like family. I mean, I was hired there to do a job, but from the first day that I started, she treated me like one of her own.
Mr. Mars, I'd like to now shift our attention to Agatha Lee's family. Could you tell us what you know about it?
Yeah, she had a daughter, died about a year after I started. Her husband was gone long before. All she had left was her granddaughter, Stevie.
When did you first meet Stevie Rogers?
Oh, when I first started, Stevie was at the house all the time. They would, playing backgammon together, that type of thing. But as she got older, she wasn't there as much.
Well, when did she stop coming around as much?
I stopped seeing her after we moved from Alabama to Midlands around 2011.
When was the next time you saw Stevie?
Next time I saw her after that wasn't until the 4th of July in 2018.
When the plaintiff returned, how did Agatha Lee react?
Well, at first, she was a bit hesitant. She kind of kept Stevie at an arm's length, but Stevie was just giving her all sorts of attention. She went into a room, Stevie would go there. If she wanted to watch a movie, Stevie would watch the movie with her. And eventually, Agatha warmed up.
Did their relationship continue to improve after that?
Yeah, Stevie was doing everything with her. But it kind of changed once Stevie tried to bring up the will.
You mentioned the
Objection,
will.
Your Honor, to lack of foundation, if I may be heard.
You may.
that this relationship between Stevie and Miss Lee changed once Stevie brought up the will. We haven't heard the necessary foundation as to how this witness would be able to understand this relationship after the will was changed.
Response?
If I may, Your Honor.
Yes.
Your Honor, I believe the witness was saying that they had warm conversations, they spent time together all the time, they were in agreement for all the time. And we haven't laid the foundation yet, but we're allowed to first ask the question before laying the foundation, which if I may proffer.
You may.
We're going to get into the conversation and how they had a disagreement. Now we're saying how the relationship, they weren't having any disagreements, things were going well, and then they got to this point in which they had disagreements.
Response, Your Honor.
Yes.
Pursuant to your prior ruling, we just asked that this foundation be laid before this information come into the record.
Yeah, I'll sustain the objection. Let's have some foundation. So to the extent the witness has answered the question at this point, we'll strike that from the record. But then, go ahead, lay the foundation, and then feel free to ask the question.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Mars, was there anything that you saw that you believe may have changed their relationship?
Yeah, they always had warm conversations when Stevie came back, but when I heard them talking about Agatha's will, it wasn't that type of conversation.
Well, we'll get into the contents of that conversation, but first I'd like to talk about Agatha's will. Could you tell us what you knew about Agatha Lee's will?
Yeah, I knew that she had two different versions. One she created after her daughter passed, and then one she updated in 2018.
And when you say it was updated, what do you mean by that?
Well, originally Agatha left everything to her granddaughter, Stevie. She changed that in 2018, and I was named her sole heir.
When you were named as the beneficiary, how did that make you feel?
I was shocked. I mean, she had already done everything for me, paid me a handsome salary to pay for everything for my family, take care of them, give me a place to live. I just didn't feel like I deserved it.
Do you know if Miss Lee ever informed the plaintiff about the change?
Yes, she wrote Stevie a letter.
How long after Miss Lee wrote the plaintiff a letter did the plaintiff return?
A few months. She had gone for 7 years, and then she wrote this letter, and Stevie was back in a couple months.
Okay, well, Mr. Mars, let's talk about that conversation you heard. Well, when did the conversation concerning Agatha's will between the plaintiff and Agatha occur?
That was August 14th in 2018.
What did you hear?
Well, I was approaching the door. I was bringing Agatha her morning tea, and I heard Stevie say that she had proved herself to be devoted to Agatha, and she wanted her to reconsider the will.
How did Agatha respond?
She paused at first and told Stevie, no.
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay the statements of Miss Lee. We'd be fine with the limiting instructions so the jury doesn't take this for the truth of the matter.
If I may, Your Honor.
You may.
Well, that's exactly what the defense is using these statements for. The truth of the matter asserted doesn't concern us. The point we're trying to make is that the plaintiff heard that she wasn't going to be allowed back into the will, and it's our assertion that she then acted after that. We're perfectly amenable to a limiting instruction as to it's going to the effect on the listener rather than the truth of the matter asserted.
It sounds like that might resolve the objection. Is that correct, counsel?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, then objection overruled as moot. The jury will be advised that they are not to take Ms. Lee's response for the truth of the matter asserted, just the effect on the listener.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Mars, what did Agatha say when the plaintiff asked about the will?
She said that she wasn't going to change her mind on it.
How did the plaintiff respond to that?
Well, Stevie, she tried to protest, but Agatha cut her off and said, no, I'm not going to give you anything else. I've given you enough.
What happened after that?
Well, the two of them wrapped up their conversation. Then Agatha came out and asked me to give her a ride to lunch.
Mr. Mars, I want to walk through the exact events that transpired on August 14th and lay out a timeline for the jury. I'm now sharing my screen and showing a timeline of the events on August 14th. At what time did the conversation end and you left for lunch?
I'm not sure on the exact time. It was a bit before noon.
What happened after you left?
Like I said, Agatha asked me to take her to lunch, so I dropped her off at lunch. She was having a lunch with a friend, and I ran some errands while she was doing that.
Do you remember what time it was that you returned after lunch?
You know, we were out for a couple hours, so sometime around 2.
Mr. Mars, during this time, do you know who was at Lee Manor?
Not exactly. When we left, the only person there was Stevie.
During this time frame when you were gone, do you know what Stevie was doing?
I have no idea.
Well, Mr. Mars, what happened after you got back to Lee Manor?
Well, I got back. Agatha asked me to cook some scones for dinner. She told me she was going to go take a nap.
What time was that?
Just a bit after we got back, 2:15.
Mr. Mars, what time did you serve dinner that night?
I'm not much of a baker, so it took me a while to get those scones done. So about 4 hours later, 6:30.
And where did you serve dinner that night?
Well, that was upstairs in the study. I told Stevie and Agatha the meal's ready, and the two of them ate in there.
What did you do after you served dinner?
Went downstairs, cleaned everything up, kind of, just tidying everything downstairs, and then I went up to my room.
Do you remember what time you returned to your room?
Yeah, 7:30.
Do you remember what time you went to bed on August 14th?
A couple hours later, my friend had told me to watch a movie called Knives Out, and I fell asleep just before it ends, so 9:30.
Mr. Mars, what happened the next morning?
It kind of started off like a normal day. Got up around 7, went for a walk, came back, kind of tidied everything up, made Agatha her coffee, and went over to her room.
Do you remember what time that was?
That was 8:30.
What happened when you got to her room?
I went in the room, called her name. She didn't say anything, so I went up to her, and she wasn't moving.
Well, Mr. Mars, we've heard today through trial that there was a will reading after Agatha passed away. Were you there for that reading?
Yes, I was.
And what happened at this will reading?
They read out Agatha's will, said that I was inheriting her estate. And I was surprised.
Why did you act that way?
Well, ever since Agatha's body was found, Stevie kept throwing around the word murder. She kept saying it was a murder, kept saying it was a murder. And at the time, I just panicked and acted like I didn't know anything.
Mr. Mars, did you ever discuss Agatha Lee's will situation with the plaintiff?
Briefly, yes.
When was that?
Well, that was August 14th, just after they had Stevie had an argument with Agatha.
What did the plaintiff say to you?
She came out of the room and she came right up to my face and she said, "Don't count your millions just yet."
Thank you. Nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Hello, Mr. Mars. My name is Julia Grieve, and I'll be asking you a few questions.
Hi, ma'am. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'd like to start by talking to you about Miss Lee's will.
Okay.
Now, she told you she was going to put you in the will back in February of 2018, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So you knew that you were getting Miss Lee's house,
That's right.
the royalties for her book,
Yes, I was supposed to inherit all of her estate if she was to pass.
and part of that estate was what you assumed to be millions of dollars in cash.
That's correct.
Now, in your own words, your family needed that money.
Yeah, My younger sister was sick and I just didn't have enough to take care of her.
And you thought Agatha's money meant your family would never have to worry about money ever again.
That's right. Yes.
I'd like to talk about what you've heard today. You've been present throughout this trial, haven't you?
Yes, ma'am.
You were here when Miss Rogers took the stand.
Yes, I was here for all the witnesses that testified today.
So you heard Miss Rogers say she had a conversation with her grandma about the will on August 14th.
Yes.
And according to Stevie, Agatha was going to put Stevie in the will and take you out.
Yes, she came up and told quite the story, but that's not what I heard.
It's your position Stevie lied about that conversation.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about what you did after that conversation. You told us that you ran some errands, but I want to be clear. One of those stops you made was at a pharmacy.
That's right. I needed some toothpaste and some mouthwash, so I needed to stop at the pharmacy.
We'll get to exactly what you bought, Mr. Mars, but you went to that pharmacy sometime between about 12 o'clock and 1:30. Is that right?
That's correct.
Mr. Millard, if you could show us that timeline. And let the record reflect, we're adding that Mr. Mars went to the pharmacy sometime between 12 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. Now, when you walked into that pharmacy, you knew that Miss Lee was allergic to chlorandramine.
Yes, I had been aware of that since I started.
And you knew Miss Lee's arthritis medication. That looks identical to chlorandramine.
Yes, that's correct. Wintrin.
And you knew chlorandramine could be purchased over the counter at any drugstore.
Anyone could buy it.
You don't have a receipt for what you bought at the store that day, do you?
No, I just bought a couple of things. I didn't think I needed to save my receipt.
Now, you told us that you were also here for the testimony of Mr. Bond, right?
That's correct.
You heard Mr. Bond say the police found a black bag inside your closet.
That's what he told me.
A black bag containing chlorandramine.
Yes.
Now, sir, the attorneys asked you about that black bag.
Yes,
They asked you if you had ever touched it before.
that's correct. And as far as I can remember, I've never seen that bag.
Well, that's not what you said. You didn't say as far as I can remember. You told them never.
That's right. I didn't remember ever seeing it or ever touching it, so I told them no.
You're aware that your fingerprint was found on that black bag.
That's what Mr. Bond said, yep.
Let's talk about what happened after Miss Lee died. You were there for the reading of her will, weren't you?
Yes, I was.
Miss Lee's attorney announced that she was leaving everything to you.
That's correct.
When you heard that, you stood up, didn't you?
I did, and I acted like I had no idea.
You said, I had no idea.
That's correct, ma'am.
And you said that over and over again, didn't you?
Yes.
Mr. Mars, I want to be clear. That wasn't an inconsistency. That was a lie.
Yes, I had known that Agatha had already changed her will to have me as her sole inheritor. Correct.
And you knew that she had changed her will months before.
Exactly, ma'am, yes.
Mr. Miller, would you pull up Exhibit 13? Mr. Mars, this is an email you wrote, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
In this email, you said, Agatha just told me she changed her will to leave everything to me.
That's correct.
You said, we're talking millions.
Yes, it was a lot of money.
You said, this is totally going to change my life.
Yes, it's an unfathomable amount. I don't know what I would do with it.
Thank you, Mr. Mars. No further questions.
Redirect, Your Honor.
Proceed.
Mr. Mars, Miss Grieve just came up here and she asked you about your family back home.
That's right.
Do you love your family, Mr. Mars?
Yes, I do.
Objection, Your Honor, to relevance as to whether Mr. Mars loves his family.
If I may, Your Honor.
You may.
Your Honor, the point Miss Grieve was trying to make is that Mr. Mars' family needed money and that Mr. Mars loved his family, and so he could have chosen his family over Miss Lee. Now, the point I'm going to make is that Mr. Mars also loved Agatha Lee and considered Agatha Lee as a grandmother. It's going to the credibility of the witness and showing that this witness was not able to kill Agatha Lee because of their relationship. It's completely relevant to this case as the plaintiff is trying to argue that Mr. Mars killed Agatha Lee for money.
Response, Your Honor.
You may.
Well, I would agree that the defendant's feelings about Miss Lee would be relevant. We've already heard his position on needing to provide his family with money, and asking if he loved his family isn't relevant, doesn't make any fact more or less likely.
If I may, Your Honor.
You may.
The point is the comparison between his feelings of his family and his feelings of Agatha Lee. It's going to show that he loved both his family and Agatha Lee, showing that the plaintiff trying to argue that he loved his family, so therefore he would murder to get money to them, isn't the case.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I'm going to let the jury hear it, give it the weight, any weight they deem fit in terms of whether, they believe the explanations given are credible or not credible. So objection overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Mars, do you love your family?
Yes, I do.
Mr. Mars, when you first started working for Agatha Lee, did you love her?
Yes.
Mr. Mars, is love a crime?
No.
Objection, Your Honor, at this point to relevance as to the defendant's feelings on whether or not love is a crime.
Your Honor, I'll move on.
Sustained.
Now, Mr. Mars, you were also asked about your visit to the pharmacy on August 14th.
That's correct.
Now, when you went to the pharmacy, did you ever buy any chlorandramine?
No, I did not.
Have you ever bought chlorandramine before in your life?
No, I know that Agatha's deathly allergic to it, and I don't allow it in the house.
Did you have anything to do with the passing of Agatha Lee?
No, she did everything for me. She's the only reason that my family's able to stay afloat. No.
Thank you, Mr. Mars. I have nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
Any recross?
No recross, Your Honor.
All
Your Honor,
right,
I then ask that this witness be allowed to step down.
yes, the witness may step down. Thank you.
Thank you.
Defense, do you have any further witnesses?
No further witnesses, Your Honor. At this point, the defense rests its case in chief and is ready to proceed with closing arguments.
All right, then we will now hear arguments from each party. Everyone should please switch back to speaker view. Counsel for plaintiff, are you ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
May it please the court. The defendant was running out of time. Members of the jury, today you learned about Agatha Lee. You learned about this woman whose life had been cut short. To the world, Miss Lee was a famous and talented author, but to Stevie, she was grandma. On August 15th, 2018, the world lost that talented writer, but Stevie lost all that was left of her family. And she didn't lose Miss Lee because she was getting old, not because she was sick, but because of the defendant. Because he needed that money and he was running out of time to get it. For these reasons, we've sued the defendant under the Slayer Statute. That says any person who knowingly causes the death of another, it can't inherit their fortune. We had to prove this to you by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning it's more likely than not, a 51% chance of probability that the defendant killed Agatha Lee. Now, we've met that burden. And we've done so through those 3 points Mr. Millard introduced at the beginning of this trial. Why the defendant did this, how the defendant did this, and what the defendant left behind. So now I'd like to walk through each of those points. And the first is why. Well, you heard it from the defendant himself. His family needed that money to care for his sick little sister and he knew they would never have to worry about money ever again. But then Stevie showed up. Stevie was getting close with her grandmother again, laughing, smiling, getting along just like they used to. And on August 14th, the defendant's fears were confirmed. Miss Lee announced she was putting Stevie in the will and taking the defendant out. The defendant knew he was running out of time to stop that from happening. So we took a trip to the pharmacy. Now, a few moments ago, Mr. Nolan showed you a timeline of what the defendant did that day, but they left out one important stop. Between 12 o'clock and 1:30 p.m., the defendant went to the pharmacy. He doesn't have a receipt for what he bought, but he knew Miss Lee was allergic to chlorandramine. He knew chlorandramine was identical to Miss Lee's arthritis medication. So the defendant bought that medicine. Around 9:35 p.m., the defendant snuck into Miss Lee's room and gave her medication. Miss Lee took it, just like the defendant knew that she would. And Miss Lee died. The defendant thought this plan was foolproof, that everyone would see Miss Lee as an old woman who passed away in her sleep. But that brings us to the third point, what the defendant left behind. Because he left behind a black bag, a bottle of pills in his own closet, and he left behind a fingerprint tying the defendant to the scene of the crime. Now, when I spoke with the defendant a few moments ago, I asked him about that black bag. I said, "Sir, those attorneys, they asked you, have you ever touched it before?" He said, "Never." Members of the jury, that wasn't true. And that's not the only lie the defendant told, not just an inconsistency, because the defendant told us about that reading of the will, where he stood up, he covered his mouth, he tried to act surprised that he was inheriting millions. The defendant told us that was a lie. In a few moments, the judge is going to give you some instructions. She'll tell you it's your job and your job alone to decide if what the defendant said can be trusted. You can reject it in its entirety. And without the words of the defendant, what do we have left? The words of Miss Ryan Cabera, who stands to gain the unpublished works of America's most famous mystery writer. We've met our burden. We've proven by a preponderance of the evidence it's more likely than not the defendant murdered Miss Lee, because there is no other reasonable explanation for the evidence you've heard. That black bag in that closet, that mysterious trip to the pharmacy the defense failed to tell you about, and the fingerprints that can't be explained. Members of the jury, the defendant killed Miss Lee because he was running out of time. Find him liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Counsel for the defense.
Closing statement, Your Honor.
Yes, proceed when ready.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. Out of money and out of options. Drew Mars was not your average caretaker. He would have gone to the ends of this earth to look after Miss Lee, and they were there for each other through thick and thin. Drew was there when Miss Lee needed to laugh with someone. Drew was there when Miss Lee needed a shoulder to cry on, and Drew was there to actually spend time with Miss Lee. And it was clear that they enjoyed each other's company. Their relationship quickly transformed from that of the average friendship to that of a family. And although that they are not blood, their bond became unbreakable. And we heard this from Miss Ryan Cabera today. She observed this this relationship with her own eyes. And she could tell that Miss Lee and Drew had a special bond, and it was undeniable that Drew loved Miss Lee, the feeling was reciprocated, and it would be unlikely that Drew would ever do the acts that opposing counsel is accusing my client of today. Because Drew was there through it all. And everywhere Drew was, the plaintiff was not. The plaintiff, Miss Rogers, missed everything. She missed Miss Lee's birthdays. She missed when Miss Lee needed her. And she missed her life. And I'd like to talk about and dive a little deeper into the actions of Miss Rogers. It was clear that she had a motive. She had inherited $2 million from her parents and was used to living a lavish lifestyle, as she said herself. She had a fast BMW and had traveled the world at a young age, and she never felt the need to have a job or ever work. Because as stated by Miss Lee in the letter that she sent the plaintiff, that Miss Lee was tired of being the plaintiff's personal ATM. Because whenever the plaintiff needed money, she went straight to Miss Lee. And as all things do, the money started to run out. And in this letter, the plaintiff realized that she would no longer be the sole beneficiary of Miss Lee's inheritance. She would no longer receive the $20 million because of Drew. And she realized that Drew was coming in between her and her $20 million. Members of the jury, the plaintiff had run out of options. The plaintiff has attempted to frame Drew through the Slayer Statute, which the plaintiff knew prior to ever arriving at Lee Manor. The plaintiff knew that if this plan had worked, she would receive every single penny of this inheritance. And this motive was made even clearer today with the help of the private investigator, Mr. Bond. As stated by the opposing counsel themselves, this is no expert. He did not have the qualifications to investigate because, as he said himself, he is not a police officer and he is not a detective. So because he was unable to do so many things, he couldn't help himself but follow the motive and the instructions of the plaintiff. Whatever the plaintiff said he should do, he did. The plaintiff wanted a toxicology report, and Mr. Bond later followed. The plaintiff said that this is a murder, and Mr. Bond couldn't help but agree. The plaintiff said that it was Drew Mars that killed Miss Lee, and that's what Mr. Bond is here to testify, had been here to testify. And members of the jury, are we supposed to believe the testimony of a private investigator who had been paid thousands of dollars by the plaintiff themselves and only continue to push the motive of the plaintiff and do their bidding? Evidence like this, members of the jury, does not stack up on innocent people. Evidence like this, members of the jury, is not coincidental. An opposing counsel today has a burden, and this burden is the preponderance of the evidence, which simply means more likely than not. An opposing counsel has been unable to show you enough evidence to prove that Drew would ever be capable of such a heinous act. And in cases like these, where there is an absence and lack of evidence, members of the jury, that's all the evidence you need. That is all the evidence you need to render the only verdict that is fair, of not liable. Thank you.
Thank you. Rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. Out of money, out of options. That wasn't the plaintiff. It was the defendant. Ms. Dodu just told you everywhere the defendant was, the plaintiff was not. And that's true. Stevie Rogers didn't take a trip to the pharmacy. Stevie Rogers didn't sneak into her grandmother's home, into her bedroom the night that she died. When her grandmother died, Stevie demanded an autopsy. She demanded a toxicology because she knew her grandmother wasn't sick the night before she suddenly died. And when she found out her grandmother had been poisoned, she knew who did it. The person who had stood outside that door and said, "No way." The defendant who said there was no way he was going to let that will be changed. The defense told you that Mr. Mars was a loving and caring nurse, that he would do anything to protect his family. But members of the jury, ask yourselves, if Mr. Mars was an innocent bystander with nothing to do with this crime, why did he tell so many lies? Why did he lie to those attorneys and say he'd never touch that bag? Why did he lie at the reading of the will and say he had no idea what he was getting? You know the answer to that question. And you saw it in that email Mr. Mars wrote. Mr. Millard, if you could pull up Exhibit 13, where the defendant explained, "Agatha's leaving me everything. We're talking millions." That this was going to change the defendant's life. But Stevie Mars was a problem. The defendant learned he was about to lose everything. He was running out of options. He was running out of money, and members of the jury, he was running out of time. Find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. All right. I think I'm supposed to proceed with my next comment after the live stream has stopped. Is that, Laura, are you there?
I think Laura is here, but I'm going to go ahead and stop the live stream on my end, and the students are going to go to their breakout rooms until we are ready to begin comments.
Okay.
So I'm sending them there now.